That's a band called Highway 13 with one of the many songs about or inspired by Bettie Page, a song called Hey Betty. Who is Bettie Page? Well, I'll tell you my story about how I discovered her. Back in 1982, I picked up a comic book called Pacific Presents. It was put out by this small independent comic book company at the time called Pacific Comics. And in the back of this particular issue, I think it was a Captain Victory story by Jack Kirby. In the back, there was a feature by Dave Stevens, who was a great artist who since left us, and he's probably the last great comic book artist I can think of. And the feature was called The Rocketeer. And there was a character in this strip called Betty, and she was this luscious creature. I mean, Dave Stevens was just a phenomenal artist. Luscious creature with black bangs and these provocative poses. And I'll admit it, that was a main reason why I was a big fan of The Rocketeer. And I would go and get the next issue. And I remember going to a comic book store to buy this issue and going up to the counter. And the guy behind the counter said to me, you know, that's a real person. And I said, oh, you're out of your mind. There's nobody on earth looked as good as this. Only an artist's rendering could be this beautiful. And he said, no, it's a real person, a pinup model named Bettie Page. And that's when I learned about the cult of Bettie Page. And just a few years later, there was a magazine, a little fanzine published called The Bettie Pages. And I would get that. That came out quarterly. And that had photos either taken by Bunny Yeager, these photos of Bettie Page on the beach, or these sort of mysterious photos where Betty was holding a whip and smiling, you know, the bondage and fetish photos from the 1950s. And I would get these issues, I guess, quarterly and read the mystery about Bettie Page. What happened to Bettie Page? She seems to have vanished. And I'd heard stories maybe she was murdered. I heard stories she became a born-again Christian and got married and had a family and never wanted to talk about her modeling past. And all around me, while this was all going on, Bettie Page was getting more and more popular just in the culture, in the mainstream. She was on the cover of albums from artists as diverse as My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult to David Lee Roth. And then eventually, in the 90s, Bettie Page was found. This was the happy ending we were looking for. And there was a book that came out by Karen Essex called The Life of a Pinup Queen. And then a few years later, there was another book that came out by Richard Foster called The Real Bettie Page, and that told a much darker story than any of us could have guessed. And it was Bettie's struggles with mental illness, an illness so severe that in 1979, Bettie allegedly stabbed her landlords and was later committed to a psychiatric facility. That's when we learned that there was much more to Bettie Page than just a smile and a whip. And our guest tonight, Mark Mori, is an Academy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker. He's just released an amazing new film called Bettie Page Reveals All, and it's Bettie Page narrating her own life story. And Mark, when do you come into the picture? Was it in the early 90s when Bettie was back in the public eye?
That was around 1993. She had disappeared in 1957, and no one knew what happened to her until 1993. She was sort of presented to the public again by Robin Leach on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
Well, it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, because she was living on Social Security at the time, right. In obscurity. But so it was about 3 years after that I met her and got to know her. I was probably one of half a dozen people who actually was able to, deal with Bettie in person, be friends with her in person. I mean, she was very reclusive, and so I started recording interviews with her as far back as 1996.
How many hours of conversation did you record with Bettie?
Altogether, I probably recorded about 6 hours of conversation with Bettie.
And when you started getting her story on tape, was it done with the express purpose of making a film, or was it a book? What's the story?
Well, it's funny. I actually started shooting the film right after I met her in 1996. There was a book release party for Bettie Page, Life of a Pinup Legend, here in New York, and I think it was around May 96. So that was the first thing I shot. So I immediately started filming. But my interviews with Bettie were more for research because they were audio recorded.
Right.
Now, they're good quality. It wasn't like we were sitting in a restaurant or something, but I didn't know how long Bettie would live. I wanted to get her story down, and I was so it was really mainly for research, and I was convinced I would get her on camera. But then when I never could get her on camera, I realized all this interview material could be the basis for her telling her own story and narrating the film of her life.
Well, that's
Nobody really had much dealings with her since 1957. I mean, she was gone from the public eye for all those years, and then even when she resurfaced in the 90s, she didn't want to go out in public, and very few people actually met her in person.
Well, I know she never wanted to be photographed in her later years, but, some photos did leak out. I think they were taken at the Playboy Mansion at a party, and I was stunned because she looked great. You could consider the passage of time and all that. She looked fantastic.
Well, that's exactly right. And in fact, she just looked, her face was a little fuller, her hair had started to gray, she still had the bangs, but she looked great, and I told her that. Everybody who knew her told her that. Part of it was she wanted to preserve that image of her from the 50s, that magic. I mean, there was magic there, and I guess she didn't want to mess with that. And I was convinced I was going to be able to, tell her that I was going to hire a Hollywood makeup and hair person, and we'd really make her look great, and then I'd be able to film her on camera, but I was never able to talk her into that.
Well, a lot of people are probably envious of you because you got to meet Bettie Page. Tell us a little bit about that experience of meeting her in person.
Well, it was a lot of fun meeting her. I mean, what you get is the personality that's behind those photographs. I mean, anybody who's seen those photographs of Bettie knows what kind of magic there is. And that comes from who she is, the person she is, her personality, and that's what I found when I met her. Now I understood why the pictures were so alive.
Aside from speaking to Bettie directly, what other research went into making this film?
I tapped into every source I could find. There was a lot of stuff on the internet, and of course I read the books she referred to, and I uncovered some photographers that had photographed her in the 50s. In fact, we've got one guy in the film who has never been interviewed, never talked about Bettie. His photographs of her had never been seen, and these were from a famous incident, the only existing photographs from when she was arrested in 1952 for indecent exposure. And it's a really funny incident because she refused to plead guilty to indecent exposure.
Right. And I should tell listeners that what we're talking about, aside from being a pinup model, there were these groups called camera clubs. And guys would get together, let's just call them budding young photographers, would get together with a model that they would hire. And in some cases, they were lucky enough to get Bettie Page. And they would take photos. Back in that time period, I don't even know how they got these photos developed. I guess they had labs in their homes.
Well, that's why a lot of the photographs were in black and white, for one thing, because you could develop that yourself a lot easier. And of course, you taking. This is one reason these clubs existed, because it was illegal to even send nude photographs through the mail. I mean, it's hard for young people to understand or believe these days, but these camera clubs existed because, the time was so repressive sexually that, I mean, Playboy magazine in the 50s was the first thing to come out with nude photographs of women.
Right. And you've got Hugh Hefner in the film, right?
Yes, Hefner is in the film, yes. And he's in love with Bettie. He kind of considers himself Bettie's godfather. Of course, Bettie was one of the early centerfolds in Playboy.
Yep.
She was Miss January 1955. But Hef really is able to explain how Bettie became this cultural phenomenon.
It's funny. Here we are talking about pinup photos taken in the early 1950s, but here in 2012, they have such cultural resonance because they never seem to go out of fashion. How do you put it into words? How do you, as the director of this movie, put into words the phenomenon that is Bettie Page?
Well, it's fun, guilt-free sex, you could say. It's kind of the good girl and the bad girl combined together. She's so innocent, yet she's doing these wild, crazy things. I mean, she's gorgeous, but yet she's doing these fetish and bondage photographs, which in those days, in the 50s, were considered pornography.
Right.
But yet she doesn't take it seriously. She has fun with it. She makes it seem like fun. In fact, I think you could say Betty made bondage and fetish mainstream.
Yeah?
She had no judgment about it, and she had no self-awareness about it. Her idea was just, hey, we're just having a good time here.
I know you've also got famous pinup photographer Bunny Yeager in the film, and Betty did an outstanding series of photos with Bunny, and those are world famous. And those were done at the end of her career, or were they in the middle?
Well, that wasn't really towards the end. That was in 1954 is when she worked with Bunny Yeager, kind of in the middle of her career.
Okay.
Her career was only 7 years long, from 1950 to 57. And so she worked with Bunny Yeager in 54. Bunny Yeager's in the film. There's a whole section where Bunny and Betty are talking about each other and the photographs they took together. I mean, some of Bunny's photographs are some of the best photographs ever of Betty.
And there's also these different genres of photos. There's the pinup photos, the kind you would have seen in Wink magazine and Eiffel. There's the Camera Club photos, which are an entirely different thing. The bondage photos she did with Irving Klaw. The Bunny Yeager beach photos. Do you have a preference? We sound like two guys in the Camera Club back in the 50s. Do you have a preference?
Well, I don't know that I have a preference. I mean, I actually have probably the largest collection, at least digitally, of Bettie Page photographs that exist. I have 20,000 Bettie Page photographs. And so it's hard to have a favorite or even a favorite period. I mean, some people have their preferences. If you like kind of what I would call the cheesecake Betty, the pinup Betty, the Bunny Yeager photographs on the beach with her are really among the best of those. But when Betty gets into the sort of kinkier fetish stuff, and she adopts these poses and these facial expressions, which are just amazing in the context, and she makes you love her and love what she's doing, even though it's kind of crazy. I mean, at least some people consider it that. So.
Well, what I liked about seeing, the Irving Klaw bondage loops was the fact that the girls seemed to be having a very lighthearted time, and Betty in particular.
Yes, well, I think, that was it. And there's some funny stories about that, because it was considered pornography to have men in the pictures, and you couldn't have bondage and fetish with nudity at the same time. So you get these girls in lingerie wrestling each other and going through these things, and it's kind of cute now, but it was kind of cutting on the borderline of pornography. I mean, Klaw was just going up to the edge of what was considered pornography. In fact, he did end up getting in trouble for it.
Oh, yeah. Did that sort of precipitate Betty's leaving the modeling business? Well,
it contributed to it. I mean, Betty was actually 27 when she started modeling in 1950. So by 1957, she was 34, and she was the most photographed model of the 20th century. I mean, there was photographs, so many photographs of her taken, and you would see her on the news. So she thought she was over-photographed, overexposed. She was 34. She thought she was getting too old. She had been brought before these Senate committee hearings on juvenile delinquency and pornography. So there was just a lot of things that came together that caused Betty to decide to retire.
Now, if I have the timeline right here, and you started speaking to Betty in 1996 and putting this movie together, it was the following year that the Richard Foster book, The Real Bettie Page, was released, and that documented her mental problems. Did she mention that to you when you first started talking to her?
She didn't talk about that at all. In fact, none of us knew about it. Nobody knew about it. Only her and her family knew about it. But then it was revealed, it came out public, and then I talked to her further about it after it became public, and she kind of had to respond to it. And so she went, once it was out in public, she talked to me about it very freely. She addresses all the issues, becoming a born-again Christian, what happened to her during those 25 years, what she thinks about this, all these fandom that's grown up, this whole cultural phenomenon that she's become. All of that is dealt with in the film. When
the Richard Foster book came out, and it was hugely controversial,
Right.
And you had everybody rushing to Betty's defense, and Hefner was rushing, and I remember that Playboy issue.
Yes, well, I think people around her were protective of her. I mean, there's just the people who knew her or just were her fans, were in love with her, didn't want to see anything negative with her. And she had a very serious mental illness. I mean, she was diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. Now, she had recovered from that, but obviously she was fragile, and she also had been penniless when she was discovered. I mean, she was, living on Social Security, and so, the facts of what actually happened are all in the film, and she talks about it, and she doesn't hesitate to talk about it, but she's not this comic book idealized person. And what I think you get in Bettie Page Reveals All that you don't get from the books or even the photographs, you get the person behind the photographs. You understand she's just a force of nature. And when you hear her tell her story and you hear the energy from her, which this was in her 70s when I interviewed her, but it's all still there, the personality, the energy. You kind of understand how she was able to pull off these photographs without really even realizing what she was doing.
Right. Sort of an accidental trailblazer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She's a trailblazer who doesn't even understand that she's a trailblazer.
I know we're talking about your film here, but I have to ask because the movie was released when Betty was alive. What did she think of the biopic, The Notorious Bettie Page? Actually,
we have a story in our film about her, what she thought about the Notorious Bettie Page, and we have a clip from that film. And I have to say, you have to see the movie, but she wasn't too happy about that film.
That's fascinating to me because in a way that movie's kind of a whitewash.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Was her financial situation getting better in that time period? Because I know there had been a bunch of issues with, let's say, less than honorable people swindling her out of money.
Yes. Well, her situation got a lot better financially. I mean, at first she was not getting all the money at first she wasn't getting anything, and there were some controversies over some of the people that were trying to represent her, but eventually Hugh Hefner, once she met him, he kind of got her lined up with some good representation, and she made a lot of money. I even heard a story that she was tipping pizza delivery boys $100 bills. So.
It's amazing because when you think about it, in terms of the 1950s, she is as well known as Marilyn Monroe now.
Well, what's even more interesting is the company that was representing her and licensing her likeness and her name was the same company that was handling Marilyn Monroe's, image and name for licensing. And Bettie Page gets more hits than Marilyn Monroe's website. And Bettie Page is more popular among young people today than Marilyn Monroe.
Wow. We are talking to Mark Mori, the director of Bettie Page Reveals All, a new documentary that Bettie Page herself narrates. And what's the story with the film? Where can we see it?
Okay, well, actually, people in the New York area can see it pretty soon. It's going to be at the Coney Island Film Festival, Saturday, September 22nd at 3 p.m.
Oh, okay.
Then it will also be in New York, and I can't be very specific, but in November at another film festival type situation in Manhattan.
Oh, okay.
That announcement will be coming soon.
Okay. I can do some creative thinking there. DVD?
We're negotiating with distributors. I mean, we have a number of distributors who are interested in this for, the digital, the streaming, downloading, DVD, and we're negotiating on that. But that probably will not come until it's in theaters and so forth, and we're negotiating that also. One of the things I'd like to see, and I don't know if we can make it happen, is like everything comes out at once. If you want to see it in the theater, you can go there. If you want the DVD, you can get it that way. If you want to go online, you can get it that way. I mean, that's ideally what I'd like to see. Some of these companies don't understand that or don't necessarily like that, so we're working on that.
I know there are some trailers for the film on YouTube, and I know you've got the Facebook page, Bettie Page Reveals All, and also Twitter. How about a website?
Yeah, BettiePageRevealsAll.com. We have the listing of the film festivals and the trailer and biography of Betty and all kinds of video and everything there.
Before I let you go, how has the reaction been from people who've seen the film?
Well, not a lot of people have seen it yet, but we've gotten a very positive reaction. I mean, Betty fans, we showed it during Viva Las Vegas, where there was a lot of Betty fans. We just had a lot of people coming and just had a great response. Robin Leach was even there introducing the film because he had originally brought Betty to public attention in '93. So.
Now, I know obviously you do so many other things and so many other projects, but what's next for you? A Tempest Storm movie, or
Actually, Tempest Storm was at the premiere in Las Vegas.
Wow!
And her manager said to me, "Well, how about a film about Tempest Storm?" So, and she certainly deserves a film.
Yeah.
But I'm just doing some TV shows right now, and as far as what comes after Betty, I mean, I'm trying to get the film out there and get it distributed. As far as the next film, I'm not sure what that would be yet.
One more thing. Since you knew Bettie Page personally, can you tell us anything about what she liked to do, her pastimes, hobbies, that sort of thing, something nobody's ever heard before?
What she really liked was old movies. The thing she was really into was old movies from the 30s and 40s and, old classic movies. Turner Classic Movies was her favorite movie channel. So.
Wow. Mark, it's been great talking to you. I wish you all the best with this project. It's you're doing the Lord's work. You really are for Bettie Page fans all over the world, and I certainly count myself among them. And
well, I hope we see you out at Coney Island on September 22nd.
It's my birthday's around that time. What a good birthday gift for myself. All right, thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Dave.